meeting right now with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Alberta. This video is actually from moments ago. Let's listen in.
Well, just last hour, Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump said they are aiming to reach a trade and security deal within 30 days. This news comes after the leaders opened the day with
no handshake, no joint statement, no family photo, just silence. And it sent a message louder than any speech at the G7 summit. While Trump landed in Alberta ready to flex tariffs and shake the world, Canada quietly refused to play along. And what happened next would send shockwaves through trade routes, global alliances, and even the streets of Chicago. The 2025 G7 summit in Alberta was supposed to be just another diplomatic gathering. Crisp suits, rehearsed smiles, and carefully managed headlines. World leaders arrived in the Canadian Rockies with the usual fanfare. But behind the high-altitude serenity, something was cracking. Donald Trump didn't waste time. As soon as he touched down, he dropped a political bomb. 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports. 10% on energy exports. It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of economic warfare, the kind that forces allies to choose sides. Trump was loud, provocative, intentional, but his Canadian counterpart, Prime Minister Mark Carney, chose something radically different. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't post a thread. He didn't even speak. Instead, he made three quiet moves that echoed louder than any speech. 1. He refused to sign the joint G7 statement, a direct break from decades of tradition. 2. He canceled the official family photo, denying Trump the symbolic moment he wanted. 3. And he withdrew from the handshake lineup, erasing the last shot of forced diplomacy. For the first time in G7 history, a world leader had launched what diplomats later called a strategic silence protest. No words, just deliberate absence. And the effect? Immediate. Suddenly, Trump was left alone. No consensus, no visuals, and no international support. His threats had sparked an explosion, but Carney's silence had already reshaped the battlefield. In global diplomacy, silence isn't weakness, it's precision. The moment Trump announced sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods and energy, the world didn't just react, it reorganized. What came next wasn't a diplomatic disagreement. It was a domino effect on a global scale. Within 72 hours, countries across the map responded, not with words, but with strategy. Canada launched Stand with Steel, a sharp, viral campaign that went live in city centers and social media feeds. The message was simple: we will not fold. Tariffs on U.S. whiskey, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and Georgia peaches followed, hitting politically symbolic products, each chosen with surgical precision. Europe wasn't far behind. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen unveiled a $150 billion Ukraine Solidarity Fund, and more importantly, a critical minerals strategy designed to reduce dependence on the U.S. altogether. The EU wasn't just defending itself, it was building an alternative. Japan took a legal route, filing a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization, citing unlawful escalation. And in a rare public alignment, France and Germany flat out rejected Trump's plan to turn the G7 into a G9, by inviting Russia and China back to the table. Macron called the idea explosive. Germany said it cannot seat Moscow while Ukraine bleeds. In just 3 days, what began as a unilateral tariff policy became a global backlash, one that united old allies, empowered trade blocs, and pushed the U.S. further into isolation. The message was crystal clear. If America chooses to go solo, the world is ready to move forward without it. This wasn't just a diplomatic moment. It was a realignment, and the center of gravity was shifting fast. While global headlines tracked Trump's fiery G7 moves in Alberta, something far more chilling unfolded back home. Away from the international stage, but with consequences just as serious. In the early hours of dawn, ICE agents launched Operation Safe Haven in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood. Without prior notice or warrants, hundreds of undocumented workers were detained in a massive immigration sweep. Entire blocks shut down, storefronts closed, families disappeared. This wasn't just a routine enforcement. It was a show of strength, time to signal domestic control while foreign diplomacy unraveled. But strength without foresight comes at a cost. Within days, the U.S. economy, already strained by rising steel tariffs, felt a new pressure point: labor shock. Restaurants faced sudden staff shortages. Farmers in California and Texas reported delayed harvests due to missing crews. Construction sites from New Jersey to Nevada had to halt work as critical roles vanished overnight. The timing couldn't have been worse. Steel tariffs were already pushing up raw material costs. Now, the labor vacuum added a second blow, quietly fueling price hikes in food, logistics, and consumer services. What began as immigration enforcement quickly snowballed into a cost-of-living crisis. Suddenly, inflation wasn't just something economists debated. It was showing up in grocery aisles, on restaurant menus, and in utility bills. And as experts warned, tariffs plus labor shortages equal a hidden tax, paid by everyday Americans. While Trump made headlines abroad, the real fire had already started at home, not with policies, but with empty kitchens, missing hands, and rising prices. While the world watched for fireworks at the G7 summit, Mark Carney lit none. He didn't face the cameras. He didn't deliver a sharp rebuke. He didn't even request a private meeting. Instead, he erased himself, and in doing so, redefined the rules of global diplomacy. No official press briefing, no handshake, no signed communique, not even a seat at the final photo. This wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate strategy, a maneuver of precision, not protest, because Carney remembered 2018. Back then, during the previous steel tariff crisis, Canada played by the rules. Carney, then a senior diplomat, had watched as the Canadian delegation negotiated in good faith, signed the G7 statement alongside its allies, only for Trump to shred it on Twitter moments after boarding Air Force One. One signature, one betrayal. That was enough. This time, Carney came prepared. He wasn't going to give Washington the photo it wanted. He wasn't going to sign a document that would be discarded before the ink dried. And he certainly wasn't going to engage in a headline war with a president who thrived on noise. Instead, he gave the world something unexpected: strategic silence. In the world of diplomacy, where every word is weighed, every gesture decoded, saying nothing can be the loudest message of all. And Carney's silence? It echoed through the corridors of the summit and left Washington shaken. Because while Trump raised tariffs, Carney withdrew the table itself, and in doing so, he turned absence into authority. While Mark Carney wielded silence like a scalpel, Europe chose volume and precision. At the heart of the Alberta summit, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stood firm and delivered a line that cut deeper than any tariff. Tariffs are taxes, and taxes are bills paid by our citizens. But it wasn't just rhetoric. She backed her words with a 5-point plan that reshaped the summit's entire tone. 1. A $50 billion expansion of the European Chip Act. 2. A $150 billion Ukraine Solidarity Fund. 3. A rare earth procurement pipeline connecting Africa to Europe. 4. A green hydrogen corridor linking Canada to the EU. 5. And the creation of a massive electric vehicle battery hub, explicitly outside U.S. influence. It wasn't just a policy proposal. It was a declaration of independence from American trade pressure. Meanwhile, France's Emmanuel Macron didn't hold back either. With his trademark smirk, he ridiculed Trump's revived fantasy of buying Greenland, a proposal so detached it barely needed a rebuttal. Germany was more direct. Chancellor Friedrich Maritz made it clear, Russia cannot have a seat at any global table while it continues bombing Ukraine. Japan filed formal action at the WTO. Mexico began drafting legal challenges against asylum-linked double tariffs from the U.S. In that room, it became obvious. The G7 was no longer 7 equals. It was 6 united voices, confronting one increasingly isolated superpower. And as the summit unfolded, one reality crystallized. The world wasn't waiting on Washington anymore. It was moving forward without it. As global headlines focused on the political theater at the G7, the economic consequences were already sinking their teeth into North America. In just 48 hours, the Toronto Stock Exchange plunged by 8 points, its sharpest dip in over a year. Investors weren't just reacting emotionally, they were responding to supply chain chaos. In Ontario, major steel foundries announced immediate shift reductions, sending workers home with uncertainty hanging over their heads. The supply lines feeding into Detroit's auto industry began to crack, prompting profit warnings from top-tier parts manufacturers. And that was only the beginning. Canada didn't wait for the U.S. to step back. It launched a wave of targeted retaliatory tariffs designed to strike symbolic and strategic pressure points in the American heartland. U.S. whiskey hit with 40% tariffs, a clear shot at Kentucky. Harley-Davidsons targeted, again, reigniting the old 2018 steel war wounds. Georgia peaches and Nebraska beef, now taxed at the Canadian border. Semiconductors and chips slowed down at customs checkpoints. This wasn't just retaliation, it was redefinition. For the first time in modern memory, Canada bypassed the Allies get a pass doctrine that NAFTA had quietly upheld for decades. The North American family narrative was over. The gloves were off, and the message was blunt. If you hit us like rivals, we'll respond like rivals. What followed wasn't noisy. It was quiet, precise, and painful. The economic map of North America was being rewritten, not through negotiations, but through quiet decisions made in factories, customs offices, and trading floors. This wasn't about tariffs anymore. It was about economic trust and how fast it was dissolving. What happened at the 2025 G7 summit in Alberta wasn't just a protest against U.S. tariffs. It marked the first visible fracture in the global order, one that no longer revolved around Washington. This was not about rebellion. It was about realignment. As Trump doubled down on his tariff-first, allies-second approach, the rest of the world quietly began building a plan B. Europe wasted no time. It fast-tracked policies to build its own supply chains, from semiconductors to rare earth minerals, so it would never again be held hostage by U.S. policy swings. Canada, traditionally America's closest economic sibling, broke away from Washington's orbit. It linked up with the EU to form a green hydrogen corridor and launched joint initiatives to secure critical minerals, everything from lithium to cobalt, from reliable non-U.S. sources. India, though just a guest at the summit, made quiet but strategic moves, attending closed-door sessions and offering signals of support for new multipolar trade alliances. Mexico, often caught in the U.S.'s policy crossfire, began drafting a legal roadmap to challenge asylum-linked double tariffs, signaling it was ready to fight its battles through international courts, not White House handshakes. Japan, a longtime ally, rerouted chip contracts and filed formal WTO complaints, stepping outside its usual quiet diplomacy and into clear action. The U.S. still sat at the table, but the rest of the seats had shifted. They were now angled toward each other, not toward Washington. The table hadn't flipped, but the balance of power had quietly moved, and the message to America was unspoken but clear. We're done waiting. We're moving forward. When the summit ended, there was no agreement, no group photo, just Trump waving alone on the steps of Air Force One. That image told the whole story. America had come to the summit with tariffs, tweets, and threats. Canada responded with silence. Europe responded with strategy. The rest of the world responded with motion. So the question isn't whether the G7 will survive. The question is, will the U.S. remain behind its tariff wall or return to the table before it's too late? Because silence may be diplomacy's sharpest weapon, and right now, it's being used against Washington with surgical precision. This is ShockWave News. Subscribe for more stories where silence speaks louder than power.